him I freely give, and I will ever love and trust him in his presence daily live. I surrender all. I surrender all to thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all to Jesus. I surrender. Make me Savior, wholly thine. Let me feel thy Holy Spirit. Truly know that thou art mine. I surrender all. I surrender all to thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. I surrender all. Lord, I will trust you. I surrender all to Jesus. I surrender, Lord. I give myself to thee. Fill me with thy love and thy power. Let thy blessing fall on me. I surrender all. I surrender all to thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. Jesus, I can trust in you. How I want to do your will. Come and take complete control. Come and heal my wounded soul. I surrender. I surrender all.
Persia, there was a king Xerxes and a queen named Vashti. King Xerxes ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to come to his party so he could show everyone how pretty she was. She refused. The king was furious. Haman was one of the king's advisors and teased the king that if word got around, no one's wife would think she had listened to her husband. At Haman's urging, king ordered that his wife be put to death. King Xerxes wasn't happy for long without a queen, so he ordered a search through the kingdom for a beautiful girl to be his bride. A beauty pageant of sorts. Esther was beautiful, gracious, and kind, just what the king was looking for. In no time at all, Esther was married to the king. Now, Esther was a Jew. The Jews had been driven out of Israel, their home, about 70 years before. Although they did their best to make a living in this strange land, they prayed that someday they would go home. Esther's uncle Mordecai raised Esther after her parents died. He encouraged Esther to hide her faith from the king and his advisors, which she did. Haman had, by this time, become a powerful man in the kingdom. He decided that given his rise in power, everyone should bow down to him. But Mordecai refused to bow down to him. Haman was very angry and asked the king to authorize a royal decree to annihilate the Jews. Mordecai found out about Haman's evil intentions and told her. Esther was afraid, but she fasted and prayed for 3 days, mustered up her courage, and went to see the king. The king spared her life and offered half my kingdom for your wishes. All she asked was that the king and Haman join her for a dinner that night. Haman was very pleased that he had been asked to dine with Esther and was filled with pride. But then he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and still Mordecai refused to bow down to him. Haman was filled with rage. He decided that Mordecai must be hung. That same night, the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of the reign, to be brought in and read to him. The book was turned to the day Mordecai exposed a plot to assassinate the king. The king was reminded of this tale and asked what reward Mordecai had received. The king's attendants told him that nothing had been done for Mordecai. The next morning, just as Haman was arriving to ask that Mordecai be hanged, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman, still filled with pride, mistakenly thought that the king was referring to him. So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what's done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Imagine Haman's shock when the king commanded, "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gates." Finally, Esther shared the secret of her faith and proclaimed herself a Jew. She begged the king to spare her people. The king was furious for Haman and ordered that he be hung. Haman's pride and cruelty had led to his own destruction, and the brave young Esther had saved her people. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. You know, in the Bible, there are a lot of stories about women, but in the Bible time, it wasn't that important to give them a name or a real life story about them. Remember, like the woman at the well? We don't know her name. The adulterous woman? We don't know her name. The woman who came and anointed Jesus' feet at one point? We don't know her name. But today, we get to hear a Bible story about a woman, and we get to hear her name. In fact, a whole book of the Bible was given to Esther. And what a delight it is that we get to share about a heroine in the Bible this morning. So here's a joke. These three men, they were hiking in the woods, and as they're hiking, they come across this raging, extreme, frightening river, and there's no way to cross it. So the first man just cries out to God and says, "Oh God, give me the strength, give me some muscle so I can get across this river." And poof, God gave him the strongest muscles in his arms and his legs, and he got to swimming across that river. It only took him 2 hours. He'd only almost drowned twice, and he made it. So the second guy who'd been traveling with him thought, well, that was a good idea. I'll just say, "God, please help me get across this river, but I don't just want the strength. I want some tools to go with it." And so he, poof, is given strong muscles and a rowboat and a paddle. It only takes him 1 hour to get across the river, and he almost capsized twice, but he made it. Finally, the third guy decided to do the same thing. He said, "Oh God, help me get across this river. Give me the strength. Give me the tools and give me the intellect to make it." And poof, God turned him into a woman. And the woman found a map, walked 100 yards upstream the river, and walked across the bridge. I'm a little excited that I get to talk about a woman today. The fact, the chapter's name, I believe, is A Woman of Beauty and Courage. And so as we look at it together, I do want to point out what Tina shared with the children. If you read the whole book of Esther, which we sort of tried to do this morning, you might notice that God's name is never in print, never written one time in the book of Esther. Yet we see God's fingerprints on every page, on every turn, in every corner. And I just want to remind you this morning, before we get any farther, that God has his fingerprints all over your story too. So let's not forget that. Like Esther, God had a plan, and he has a plan for you. And I want us to look at 3 things about God's plan that Esther discovered, and I think you and I could probably agree on in our faith journey. First of all, God's plan sometimes surprises us, but it never surprises God. Sometimes God's plan scares us, but it's never scary to God. And sometimes God's plan, we just don't get it. But God always gets it. So let's look at the first one. God's plan for you might surprise you, but it never surprises God. I want to just list out for you some surprises that happened in Esther's life that she never saw coming. First of all, we know that her parents died when she was a little girl. She was surprised that that happened, and then she went to live with her uncle Mordecai. Was certainly not part of her plan. Esther was a Jew living in a Persian world and had to keep her identity quiet. Being taken to live in a king's palace, she ended up marrying a prideful king. Esther never dreamed of a time where she would have to choose between her own life and standing up for the lives of her people, the Jews. Now, there were some good surprises for Esther, too. We know that Esther, even though it wasn't planned, she did get to live in a palace, which she would not have done had it not been part of God's plan. And living in a palace means you have experiences that you would never have had. She got to rub elbows with people that she would have never rubbed elbows with. She had opportunities and provisions that she would have never had on her own. You don't have to share this out loud, but I want you to think for a minute to yourself. What's a surprise that's happened in your life plan? What's something like Esther that was unexpected, that you didn't see coming? Esther had a list of surprises, and I bet you do too. Now, you know, sometimes the word surprise can be a good thing, an exciting thing. If you've ever been given a surprise, it's really fun, and there's an excitement to that. There's joy in that, in the unexpected. There's wonder. But there's others of us that don't love surprises. We'd rather be throwing the surprise. You kind of want to be the person behind the scenes. I wonder if we took a vote. We're going to right now. We're going to take a vote. I just am curious, how many of you like a surprise, or would you prefer to throw the surprise? If you like a good surprise, raise your hand. Okay. Now, if you prefer not a surprise, you'd rather just maybe give someone else a surprise. Let's see who you are. Ooh, you know what? I think there's more that would prefer to be the one that gives the surprise. Some of us like to know what to expect. Either way, we could all agree that some of us have been surprised in our life journey. I was excited because Tim, he offered all of his books that he's not going to need to carry with him into retirement. He offered them to us, and of course he's offered them to you. You may have seen that on Facebook. Go down there today in his office. There's beautiful shelves of awesome Christian books, and you're welcome to any that you want. But thankfully I got this one before you did, because I was looking through his books and I found this, The Master Plan. And I was super excited because I thought Tim is really good at what he does. And he's been doing it a lot longer than me. And now I've got his master plan. So I was super excited. I thought I'm going to use this. And I opened it up. You know, I think maybe Tim is just following after Esther's own heart. That maybe we're not supposed to have the master plan. Maybe we have to trust that God has the master plan. Your story is not a surprise to God. God has never once looked at your life and said, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Sorry that happened." God has never looked at his child and said, "Oh dear, now what am I going to do? I'm going to have to come up with another plan." Jeremiah 29:11 is a very famous verse that many of us lean on, and I think it's the verse that will combat if you're one of those people worrying about what's next. And this is what Jeremiah 29 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to give you hope and a future." God says, you don't have to know, you don't have to have the master plan, because I know the plan, and I promise you this, it will give you hope and it will bring you a future. So Wednesday, I went to the middle school and I was teaching our little Bible club, and I decided this week, usually the leaders, we bring a Bible verse to share, and I decided this week to let the students go up on the board and write down a verse that they like, and if they couldn't remember the verse, they would give me little tidbits and I would help them figure out what their favorite verse was. You know, one of the first verses that came up on that board, I took a picture of it. You can't read it because it's crazy, but I want you to see all those verses they wrote. And here was the verse they wrote. God has good plans for you. Jeremiah 29:11. It's just one of those sweet reminders that God has a plan, whether you know it or not, whether it's full of surprises or it's quite predictable right now. God has a plan. You can take that slide down. We're moving on. God's plan might scare you, but it doesn't scare him. Esther's situation, in case you didn't catch it while Tina was talking, it looked pretty bleak. Not only did her future look a little scary, all of her people's future looked a little scary. Remember, her parents were absent and gone. She lost them at a young age. She was uprooted. Her life was in an unknown place. There was this guy named Haman who was the bigwig in the palace, and he was always sabotaging, always trying to figure out a way to take her and her uncle down. She had the king who ended up, she won his favor, but I'm going to tell you, he was a prideful and demanding person. He wasn't easy. He was scary. Wonder what you're afraid of today. I think all of us could identify something that we sort of feel anxious about and nervous about and scared of. There's something in your spirit, I'm sure, like mine, that there's a little unrest. Maybe there's a change ahead for you. Maybe there's an opportunity that's coming your way and it's kind of scary. Maybe there's somebody like Haman who scares you. You know, oftentimes what happens when we as believers are afraid, when we start living in that fear, we immediately start resisting. And we start kind of putting on the brakes of God's plan. I love the story of these two fellas, and they were riding on one of those tandem bikes where one's on the front and one's on the back, and they're going up this really steep hill, and it's really hard, and the front guy, he's just working it. They finally make it to the top, and they stop to take a breath, and the front guy goes, "Man, that was a tough ride." And the one behind him said, "Yeah, good thing for me, I kept the brakes on really hard the whole way up. I didn't want us to slide backwards." Sometimes we do that with God. I think he needs my help. I'm going to slow things down a little bit. I'm scared of what you've got going, so I'm going to help you, God. I'm going to help you figure it out. I love what Esther did. She modeled for us that it's okay to be afraid. You're going to have times where it's scary. But look what she did. She gathered her people and said, "Fast with me and pray with me for 3 days." In other words, join with me and let's do this together because we don't know what's next and it's scary, so let's just fast and pray. See, what she was doing was she was aligning her spirit with God's spirit. Instead of putting on the brakes, she was saying, let's just wait on him. I'm sure he'll tell us what's next. It reminds me of another verse of hope. When you need to combat that fear, remember what Joshua said? He said, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." At Travel Together weekend, we had a retreat here at church. And so Sherry, she said she'd come help me. That was a lot. That's like, Sherry said she'd come help me. And so we're going to demonstrate for you what this sort of looks like. We're going to pretend like this beautiful chair is actually a boat, okay? Just put your imagination on. She's going to rest in the boat. She has a paddle. She's good to go. We're going to have Tyler do what some of us do in our faith journey, is we're just clinging to the side of the boat. Our legs are kind of flailing and kicking and trying to hold on for dear life. Sherry's just hanging out and resting in her faith. And then poor Bev Ingalls, she volunteered to do this, bless her. She was at the weekend. Sometimes in our faith journey, we're doing what Bev did. You're trying to swim on your own. You're nowhere near the boat where you get to rest. Sometimes you're swimming along beautifully, and sometimes you're drowning. Sometimes you can barely keep your head above water. This is what faith looks like. We're always with our God, but sometimes we're resting and trusting. Sometimes we're helping him out, and we're kicking and thinking that's going to help, and sometimes we're out on our own, barely making it. Thank you, dear actors and actresses. Beautiful, beautiful job, beautiful job. Esther somehow learned, even through hard, scary times, somehow she learned to rest in the boat and use the tools that God gifted her with. I want us to look at one more thing about God's plan. I want to remind you that God gets you, and he gets your plan even when you don't get it. And the way I want to remind you is to just look at the two most famous verses from Esther. The two most famous verses are, the first one is when Mordecai says, "Who knows, Esther? Perhaps you've come to your royal position for such a time as this." He says to her, "Esther, you get to be the queen. You get to be the one that stands up to the king, and I don't know, and we don't know how that's going to end, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but God does. He knows." God knows for you too, that for such a time as this is where you're supposed to be. That for such a time as this is the circumstance that you're facing. And it's just for a time as this. Whatever feelings you may be battling or anxieties that you're battling, be reminded this morning that it's just for a time like this that God has you in that place. The second famous verse in the book of Esther is when Mordecai asked Esther to go put her fears aside, stand up for the deliverance of the Jews. And Esther is supposed to go and approach the king, ask him for mercy, plead on the behalf of all the Jewish people. And she knew that that meant she could die. But finally, after grappling with it and battling it, you know what she says? "If I perish, I perish." What a beautiful picture of faith. That I would rather have the presence of God than perfection or the plan that I had designed for myself. So here's your verse of hope that will combat when you're in that place of doubt, when you're in a season of not getting it, is from Isaiah 55. "My thoughts are not your thoughts, declares the Lord. Neither are my ways your ways. My ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts." My ways are not your ways. My plans are not always your plans. But God has got you. In your bulletin, you're going to find a little prayer of confession. See if you can hunt that down. I don't even know what page it's on. I borrowed it. I didn't write it. I borrowed it. And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. It's all about how we struggle as believers with God's plan. And so Lara has agreed to just play some music so that you might have a moment to pray this prayer, to read the prayer, to see if it aligns with your spirit, to see if maybe there's something in this prayer of confession that you might also need to say to your Maker.